The discovery was made on a Tuesday morning in March 1847. A cotton merchant from Savannah, traveling through the rural roads of central Georgia, stopped to water his horse near a small plantation. The air was thick with humidity, unseasonably warm for early spring. Fog still clung to the low places in the fields, creating an almost dreamlike quality to the landscape. Charles Dennison had been riding since dawn, eager to reach the next town before nightfall. His horse, a bay Marare named Constance, had started favoring her left front leg about a mile back, and he decided not to push his luck. The small creek running alongside the plantation property seemed like a perfect place to rest. He dismounted, led Constance to the water, and was checking her hoof when he heard the sound. A bell ringing out across the fields, the signal for the enslaved workers to begin their day. It was a sound Dennis had heard 1,000 times before on plantations across Georgia. Nothing unusual about it, but what he saw when he looked up made him freeze mid-step. The workers were emerging from their quarters, a long wooden structure positioned about 200 yards from the main house. They moved in that particular way that enslaved people developed, efficient but not rushed, conserving energy for the long day ahead, avoiding any movement that might be interpreted as either laziness or insubordination. Among them were children. That wasn't unusual either. Children as young as 5 or 6 were often put to work in the fields, starting with simple tasks like carrying water or picking up dropped cotton. But these children were different. Even from a distance, even through the morning fog, Dennis could see that their skin was pale, not the light brown of mixed ancestry that was common enough on plantations, but truly pale, almost translucent in the early morning light. As they moved into the fields and the sun began to burn away the fog, he could see more details. Hair that ranged from light brown to almost blonde, features that were unmistakably European. Dennis counted them as they dispersed into the cotton rows, 12 children ranging from what looked like 3 or 4 years old to early adolescence. Every single one of them had similar features, similar builds, the same distinctive eye color that he could make out even at this distance. Unusual hazel green that caught the light. They looked like siblings. They looked like they all belonged to the same family. They did. An overseer appeared, a thick-set man carrying a long stick, not quite a whip, but close enough to serve as a threat. He barked orders, and the children moved faster, taking their positions in the fields alongside the adult workers. The older ones carried baskets. The younger ones followed behind, learning, being trained in the work that would consume their lives. Dennison stood there, still holding his horse's hoof, trying to process what he was seeing. He'd been in the cotton trade for 20 years. He'd visited dozens of plantations. He'd seen enough to understand how the system worked, even if he tried not to think too hard about the human cost involved in the bales of cotton that made him his living. But this was different. This was something that made his stomach turn in a way he couldn't quite explain. He released Constance's hoof. The mare was fine, just a small stone that he'd already removed, and led her to a hitching post near the plantation entrance. He needed to know more, needed to understand what he was seeing. The plantation house itself was modest by the standards of the larger operations. 2 stories, white painted wood, a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides, well maintained but not ostentatious. The house of a man who was comfortable but not wealthy, successful but not elite. As Dennis approached, a man emerged onto the porch. He was in his early 40s, Dennis estimated, with dark hair graying at the temples and a neatly trimmed beard. He wore a simple white shirt and dark trousers, no jacket despite the morning chill. In his hand was a cup of coffee, steam rising from the rim. The man was watching the fields, watching the workers, watching the children, and on his face was an expression that Dennis would later describe as satisfaction. The look of a man surveying his property, his possessions, his investments. "Morning," the man called out, his voice friendly, welcoming. "You look like you could use some coffee yourself. Come on up." Dennison hesitated for just a moment, then climbed the steps to the porch. The man extended his hand. "Horace Crawford," he said. "This is my place you're passing through, I assume. Charles Dennis, out of Savannah, cotton merchant. My horse needed water, and I thought I might inquire about purchasing rights to your harvest if you haven't already contracted with another buyer." It was a lie, or at least partially so. Dennis had come this way, hoping to establish new business contacts, but he hadn't planned to stop at this particular plantation. That had been pure chance, or perhaps something else, something that felt uncomfortably like fate. Crawford's face brightened. "Always happy to talk business. Come inside. My wife will prepare us a proper breakfast, and we can discuss terms." As Dennison followed Crawford into the house, he glanced back once more at the fields, at the children with their pale skin and European features working in the morning sun, at the overseer watching them with his stick in hand, at the nightmare that had been hiding in plain sight. Before we continue with the story of what Charles Dennison discovered that morning and the shocking investigation that followed, take a moment to subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. Hit that notification bell so you never miss stories like this one, stories that reveal the darkest corners of American history. And let us know in the comments what state or city are you listening from. We love hearing from our audience across the country. Now, let's return to that plantation in Georgia, where nothing was quite what it seemed, and where Dennison was about to learn the full extent of what Horace Crawford had built. The interior of the Crawford house was exactly what Dennis expected. Comfortable but not luxurious, furnished with pieces that spoke of established prosperity rather than new money. A parlor to the left with a piano that looked like it was actually played, judging by the sheet music stacked on top. A dining room to the right with a table that could seat 10, though Dennison suspected it rarely hosted that many guests. The walls were decorated with paintings of pastoral scenes, the kind of generic landscapes that merchants sold from catalogues. Nothing distinctive. Nothing that revealed much about the people who lived here. Crawford led him into the dining room and called out toward the back of the house, "Margaret, we have a guest for breakfast." A woman appeared in the doorway leading to the kitchen. Presumably Mrs. Crawford, though she looked younger than her husband by at least a decade. She was pretty in a faded way, with blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun and a dress that was well made but practical, not fashionable. Her expression was polite but distant, the look of someone who'd learned to wear a mask of pleasantness, regardless of what she actually felt. "Mr. Dennison, a cotton merchant from Savannah," Crawford said. "Charles, my wife, Margaret." She nodded acknowledgement but didn't extend her hand or smile. "I'll have the girl bring coffee and biscuits," she said quietly, then disappeared back through the doorway. Crawford seemed not to notice his wife's coldness. He gestured for Dennis to sit at the table and took the chair at the head, the position of authority, even in this casual setting. "So, cotton merchant," Crawford said, "you've picked a good year to be in the business. Prices are holding steady and the crop's looking strong. I'm projecting a 20% increase over last year's yield." Dennis made appropriate noises of interest, but his mind was elsewhere. He was trying to figure out how to ask about the children without being obvious, without revealing his discomfort. In the social codes of the plantation South, a white man questioning another white man's treatment of his enslaved people was considered rude at best, suspicious at worst. But he didn't have to ask. Crawford brought it up himself. A young woman, enslaved, Dennison realized, though she wore a clean dress and an apron that indicated housework rather than fieldwork, brought in a tray with coffee, biscuits, butter, and jam. She moved silently, efficiently, keeping her eyes down. She couldn't have been more than 16 years old, and her skin was dark enough that she clearly hadn't been among the pale children. And Dennis had seen in the fields. As she poured coffee into their cups, Crawford spoke to her without looking at her. "Tell Rebecca to make sure the young ones get extra water today. It's going to be hot, and I don't want any of them getting sick." "Yes, sir," the girl murmured, finishing with the coffee and backing away toward the kitchen. Dennis saw his opening. "The young ones." Crawford took a sip of coffee and smiled. That same smile Dennis had seen on the porch, the smile of satisfaction. "You notice them, I assume. Hard not to. They stand out quite a bit." "I did notice," Dennis said carefully. "Quite a few children out there with unusual features. 17, actually," Crawford said, and there was something in his voice. "Pride, accomplishment. Though 2 of them are too young for field work yet. The oldest is 13 now, named him Thomas. Strong boy, good worker. I expect he'll fetch a premium price when I sell him next year." The casual way Crawford said it. When I sell him next year, made Dennis's hand tighten on his coffee cup. He forced himself to maintain a neutral expression, to keep playing the role of interested merchant, nothing more. That's quite a few children, he said. Your workforce must be expanding rapidly. Crawford leaned back in his chair, and now the pride in his expression was unmistakable. I've been implementing a breeding program, he said, using the same tone someone might use to discuss agricultural techniques or livestock management. Started about 12 years ago, not long after I inherited this place from my father. The results have exceeded my expectations. Dennison felt his stomach turn, but he forced himself to keep listening, to keep asking questions. He needed to understand the full extent of what was happening here. A breeding program, he repeated, trying to sound curious rather than horrified. Exactly. See, most plantation owners don't think strategically about reproduction. They leave it to chance to natural increase. Whatever happens, happens. But I realized there was an opportunity for deliberate improvement. Crawford warmed to his subject, speaking faster, more animated. I select specific women, young, healthy, with certain physical characteristics. Light skin is a factor, but more important is bone structure, facial features, overall build, and then I ensure that the next generation carries the traits I want to emphasize. Dennis understood what Crawford was saying, understood exactly what ensure meant, but he needed to hear it stated explicitly. You're saying you father the children yourself? Of course. Crawford said it, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. That way, I control the bloodline completely. No uncertainty about parentage, no variables I can't account for, and the results speak for themselves. Those children you saw, every buyer who's seen them has been impressed. They pass for white in most contexts, which means they're valuable for housework, personal service, positions where appearance matters. I can get twice what I'd get for a darker field worker. He was describing his own children, 17 of them, as products, as investments, as things to be sold for maximum profit. Dennison tried to imagine what that must be like to grow up knowing your father viewed you as nothing more than property, as livestock to be bred and sold. The psychological horror of it was almost worse than the physical reality. And the mothers? Dennis asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. How do they respond to this arrangement? For the first time, Crawford's expression shifted slightly, not to shame or regret, but to irritation, the way someone might react to an unexpected complication in an otherwise successful business venture. Most accept it, he said. They understand their position, understand that cooperation makes their lives easier. I'm not cruel, Mr. Dennis. I don't beat them unnecessarily. I make sure they're fed adequately during pregnancy, that they have time to recover after birth, though not too much time, of course. Can't afford to have valuable workers idle. And if they don't accept it, Dennis pressed. Crawford's eyes hardened. Then I make it clear that acceptance isn't optional. I own them, Mr. Dennison. They don't have the luxury of refusal. This is my property, my plantation, my right as their master. The law is quite clear on that point. The brutality of the statement delivered snorts so calmly, so matter-of-factly, made Dennis's vision blur for a moment with anger, but he couldn't show it, not yet, not until he knew more, until he had evidence, until he could figure out what, if anything, could be done about this. Margaret Crawford reappeared in the doorway, her face still expressionless. Horace, you have a visitor. Mr. Bennett from town about the feed order. Crawford stood, his businesslike demeanor returning immediately. Excuse me for a moment, Mr. Dennis. Help yourself to more coffee. I'll be right back to discuss the cotton purchase. As Crawford left the room, Dennis sat in silence, trying to process everything he'd just heard. The casual admission of systematic rape, the cold calculation of breeding human beings for profit, the complete absence of shame or recognition that any of this might be wrong. He thought about those children in the fields, 17 of them, 17 lives created not out of love or even desire, but as a deliberate business strategy, growing up enslaved by their own father, knowing that when they reached a certain age, he would sell them away without hesitation. How many of them knew the truth? How many understood that the man who owned them was also the man who had fathered them? How did you live with that knowledge? Margaret Crawford was still standing in the doorway watching him. For a moment their eyes met, and Dennison saw something in her expression, a flash of something that might have been pain or anger or despair. Then it was gone, replaced by that same blank politeness. "More coffee, Mr. Dennison?" she asked quietly. "No, thank you," he managed to say, then taking a risk. "Mrs. Crawford, does the minister ever visit the plantation?" It was a coded question, a way of asking whether anyone from outside ever witnessed what happened here, whether there was any external oversight or accountability. Margaret's expression didn't change, but her hands clasped in front of her apron tightened slightly. "We attend services in town eve." "Rye Sunday," she said. "The Reverend considers my husband a pillar of the community, very generous with his donations." Of course he was. Men like Crawford always were. Generosity bought silence, bought complicity, bought the willingness of others to look away from uncomfortable truths. "I see," Dennis said. "Thank you for the coffee and hospitality." Margaret nodded once and disappeared back into the kitchen, leaving Dennis alone with his thoughts and his growing horror at what he discovered. When Crawford returned 15 minutes later, full of apologies for the interruption and ready to discuss cotton prices and delivery schedules, Dennis played along. He negotiated a preliminary agreement, promised to send formal contracts within the week, and made plans to visit again in the fall to inspect the harvest. He had no intention of keeping any of those promises, but he needed Crawford to believe that their interaction had been purely business, that Dennis had seen and heard nothing troubling, that everything was normal. As he rode away from the plantation an hour later, Constance moving at an easy walk beneath him, Dennis kept glancing back at the fields, at the children working in the sun, at the nightmare hiding behind a facade of southern gentility and economic prosperity. He couldn't stop thinking about one detail in particular. When Crawford had mentioned the oldest child, Thomas, age 13, he'd said he planned to sell him next year, which meant the boy had perhaps 12 more months with whatever family he'd known his entire life. 12 months before he was torn away, sold to strangers, shipped off to some other plantation where he'd spend the rest of his life among people who had no connection to him, no knowledge of where he came from. And Crawford spoke about it the same way someone might discuss selling a horse or a piece of furniture. Charles Dennis had been born into a world where slavery was normal, where fortunes were built on the backs of enslaved labor, where white supremacy was so deeply embedded in the culture that most people never questioned it. He'd participated in that system his entire adult life, profiting from it, accepting it as the natural order of things. But this was different. This crossed some line that even his conditioned conscience couldn't ignore. This was something that demanded action, demanded response, demanded that he do something, anything to stop it. The question was what and who would help him. Savannah in 1847 was a city of contrasts. Elegant squares designed by James Oglethorpe a century earlier created pockets of ordered beauty amid the chaos of a booming port city. Spanish moss hung from ancient oak trees, giving the place an air of timeless gentility. But beneath that surface, beauty was an economy built entirely on the labor of enslaved people and the cotton they produced. The city's docks were constantly busy with ships loading bales of cotton destined for textile mills in New England and England. Auction houses operated openly, selling human beings alongside furniture and livestock. Enslaved people moved through the streets, running errands for their masters, carrying goods, building the city's expanding infrastructure. Charles Dennis had an office in a building overlooking one of the main squares. From his window on the second floor, he could see the daily flow of commerce, the steady movement of capital and labor that made Savannah one of the wealthiest cities in the South. But when he returned from the Crawford Plantation that Tuesday afternoon, he couldn't focus on the paperwork waiting on his desk. The ledgers that usually demanded his attention seemed meaningless. The cotton contracts that represented his livelihood felt like complicity in a system he was only now beginning to truly see. His clerk, a young man named Robert Parrish, noticed his distraction immediately. "Everything all right, Mr. Dennis? You seem troubled." Dennis looked up from the contract he'd been staring at without reading for the past 20 minutes. Robert was 23, born in Savannah, son of a local lawyer, good with numbers, reliable, discreet, but could he be trusted with what Dennis had learned? "Robert, may I ask you a question of a sensitive nature?" The younger man sat up straighter, curious. "Of course, sir. In your experience, in your observations of how plantations operate, have you ever heard of systematic breeding programs, where the master deliberately fathers children with enslaved women as a business strategy?" Robert's expression shifted from curiosity to discomfort. He glanced toward the door, as if checking to make sure no one else was within earshot, then spoke quietly. "I've heard rumors," he admitted, "never anything specific, never anyone naming names, but there are stories, whispers about certain plantations where all the children look suspiciously similar to the owner. It's one of those things people know about but don't discuss in polite company. Why not? Because what would be the point?" Robert's voice carried a note of resignation. "The master owns the women. The law gives him absolute authority over his property, including their bodies, including any children they bear. There's no legal remedy, no crime being committed, so people ignore it, pretend they don't see it, and life goes on. That doesn't trouble you?" Robert was quiet for a long moment. "Of course it troubles me. I'm not a monster, Mr. Dennis, but I'm also not naive. I know how the world works. The entire economy of this region, our livelihoods, our wealth, our society, it's all built on the labor of enslaved people. Once you start questioning one aspect of the system, where do you stop? How do you participate in any of it with a clear conscience?" It was the question Dennis had been asking himself all afternoon. Once you saw the system clearly, once you understood its full scope of cruelty, how did you continue to benefit from it? How did you sleep at night knowing your comfort was purchased with other people's suffering? He told Robert about the Crawford Plantation, about the 17 children with their pale skin and European features, about Crawford's casual admission of his breeding program, his cold calculation of profit and loss, about the plan to sell Thomas, the oldest child, next year. Robert listened without interrupting, his expression growing more troubled with each detail. "What are you going to do?" he asked when Dennis finished. "I don't know," Dennis admitted. "I was hoping you might have suggestions. You could report it to the authorities and tell them what? That Crawford is fathering children with women he owns? That's not illegal. That Crawford is selling his own children. They're legally considered property following the condition of the mother. There's no law being broken. Then maybe you need to think about changing the laws. That takes time, years probably. In the meantime, Crawford continues what he's doing, and those children continue to suffer." Robert leaned back in his chair, thinking, there is one person in Savannah who might be able to help. Dr. William Preston. He's been practicing medicine here for 30 years, treats patients on plantations all across the region. If anyone has seen the real conditions, the real costs of the system, it's him. And I've heard he has sympathies that not everyone in Savannah shares. It was a careful way of suggesting that Dr. Preston might be sympathetic to abolition, or at least critical of slavery's worst excesses. In Savannah, in 1847, such views had to be expressed carefully, coded in ways that allowed for plausible deniability if questioned by the wrong people. Do you think he'd talk to me? Only one way to find out. His office is on Abercorn Street, 3 blocks from here. But Mr. Dennison, be careful. If you start making inquiries asking too many questions, people will notice. And if Crawford finds out you're investigating him, there could be consequences. Men like that have friends, connections, power. They don't take kindly to outside interference. Dennis understood the warning, understood the risk he was taking. But he also understood that doing nothing, returning to his normal life, and pretending he hadn't seen what he'd seen wasn't an option. Not anymore. "Thank you, Robert. I appreciate your honesty. What do you want me to tell people if they ask where you are? Tell them I'm pursuing a new business opportunity, which, in a way, I suppose I am." As Dennis left the office and walked through the streets of Savannah toward Dr. Preston's office, he noticed things he'd somehow managed to overlook for years. The auction house on the corner, where families were being separated and sold to different buyers. The scarred backs visible when enslaved workers bent to lift heavy loads. The careful expressions they wore, masks designed to hide whatever they actually felt, to show only what their masters wanted to see. How had he participated in this for so long without really seeing it? How had he been so willfully blind? The answer, uncomfortable as it was, came down to self-interest. It was easier not to look too closely, easier not to ask difficult questions, easier to accept the comfortable lies about natural hierarchies and civilizing influences and the burden of uplift. The truth was messy and disturbing and demanded actions that would risk his business, his social standing, his comfortable life. But he looked, he'd seen, and now he couldn't pretend otherwise. Dr. William Preston's office occupied the ground floor of a narrow brick building. A small sign beside the door read simply, "Preston, Physician." The door was unlocked and Dennis stepped into a waiting room that smelled of carbolic acid and something else. Illness perhaps, or just the accumulated suffering that any doctor's office inevitably absorbed. An older woman sat behind a desk sorting through papers. She looked up as Dennis entered. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but I was hoping Dr. Preston might spare a few minutes. It's a matter of some urgency. He's with a patient right now, but if you're willing to wait, I'll let him know you're here." "Your name?" "Charles Dennis." She wrote it down on a slip of paper and disappeared through. G.H. An interior door. Dennis sat in one of the waiting room chairs and tried to organize his thoughts. What exactly was he going to say to the doctor? What did he hope to accomplish? He was still trying to figure that out when Dr. Preston appeared, the older woman beside him. William Preston looked to be in his early 60s, with a full head of white hair and a neatly trimmed beard. He wore spectacles that magnified his eyes slightly, giving him an owlish appearance. His clothes were well made but practical, the outfit of a professional man who spent his days working rather than attending social functions. "Mr. Dennis," the doctor said, extending his hand, "Margaret tells me it's urgent. Are you unwell?" "No, nothing like that. I need to speak with you about a professional matter. Plantation medicine specifically." Something shifted in Preston's expression. Not alarm exactly, but a heightened attention. "Come into my office. Margaret, please reschedule my 4 appointment. This may take some time." The doctor's office was exactly what Dennis expected. Shelves lined with medical books, a desk covered in papers and correspondence, anatomical diagrams on the walls, and the pervasive smell of various medicines and tinctures. Preston gestured for Dennis to sit in a chair facing the desk, then settled into his own seat with a slight grimace that suggested chronic back pain. "Now, Mr. Dennison, what brings you to my door?" Dennison took a breath and began the same story he'd told Robert. The Crawford Plantation, the children with European features, Crawford's admission of his breeding program, the casual mention of selling his oldest son next year. Preston listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each detail. When Dennison finished, the doctor was quiet for a long moment, staring at his desk as if gathering his thoughts. "You want to know if what Crawford is doing is illegal?" Preston finally said, "It wasn't a question. I want to know if there's any way to stop him." Preston stood, walked to a cabinet against the wall, and pulled out a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. He poured generous amounts into both, handed one to Dennis, and drank deeply from his own before speaking again. "I've been practicing medicine in this region for 31 years, Preston said. "I've delivered hundreds of babies on plantations across Georgia. I've treated illnesses, injuries, complications from childbirth, wounds from punishments. I've seen things that would make a hardened soldier weep. And the Crawford situation, it's not even the worst I've encountered." The statement was delivered with such weariness, such resignation that Dennis felt his hope beginning to fade. "But it is one of the most systematic," Preston continued. "Crawford isn't acting out of impulse or passion or even simple abuse of power. He's implemented a calculated strategy optimized for profit. That's what makes it particularly disturbing. The cold rationality of it. You've been to his plantation several times over the years. First call was in 1835, I believe. A difficult birth. Young woman named Mary, 17 years old. The baby survived. A girl with skin light enough that I knew immediately who the father was. Crawford's eyes. Exactly. No mistaking it. Did you say anything to him?" Preston laughed bitterly. Say what? Congratulate him on his daughter. Remind him that she's also his property, that he could sell her or work her or do whatever he pleased, because the law gives him that right. I swed up the woman, made sure the baby was breathing, collected my fee, and left. That's what I did. That's what I've always done. But you kept going back. He kept calling for me. Difficult births, complications, infections. I delivered 6 or 7 of those children myself, maybe more. Lost count after a while. Preston finished his whiskey and poured another. Do you know what the mortality rate is for enslaved women during childbirth, Mr. Dennis? About twice as high as it is for white women. Want to know why? Because they don't get adequate care before birth, they're forced back to work too soon after, and complications that would be treated seriously in a white patient get ignored until they become life-threatening. Is that what happened on the Crawford Plantation? Preston's hand tightened on his glass. 3 women died on that plantation between 1835 and 1844, 3 that I know of, all of them within 2 weeks of giving birth, all of them because Crawford insisted they return to fieldwork before they'd properly recovered. I argued with him, tried to explain the medical risks, told him he was endangering their lives. He didn't care, said he couldn't afford to have valuable workers idle, said they were exaggerating their symptoms to get out of work, said I was being too soft. That's murder, Dennis said quietly. Is it? Crawford would argue he was simply exercising his right to manage his property as he saw fit, that the women's deaths were unfortunate, but not his fault, just the natural risks of childbirth. Any lawyer would raise reasonable doubt within minutes, any jury of his peers. Wealthy white men who own slaves themselves would acquit him without hesitation. Dennison felt his frustration rising. So there's nothing that can be done, no law, no authority, no justice available. I didn't say that. Preston leaned forward. I said a criminal prosecution would fail. But there are other approaches, other ways to apply pressure, to create consequences, to make Crawford's life difficult enough that he might reconsider his practices. What kind of approaches? Preston stood and walked to his bookshelf, pulling down a worn leather journal. He flipped through pages covered in cramped handwriting, found what he was looking for, and turned the book toward Dennison. I keep records, Preston said. Notes on every patient I treat on plantations, not just medical details, but observations about conditions, treatment, outcomes. I've been doing it for years, building documentation of exactly what the system does to people. Someday, when the political climate changes, when there's finally a will to address these issues, this evidence might matter. Dennis scanned the page. It was a detailed account of a birth at the Crawford Plantation, dates, patient name, complications, Crawford's refusal to allow adequate recovery time, the woman's subsequent death from infection, all written in precise medical terminology that would be difficult to refute or dismiss as hearsay. How many of these do you have? Hundreds, maybe 1,000 pages by now, multiple plantations, multiple owners, years of documentation. Preston closed the journal. But here's what matters for your purposes. I also have connections. Not the kind of connections that help in polite society, but the kind that might be useful for someone looking to challenge the system. People who help enslaved individuals escape to freedom. People who expose the worst abuses to northern newspapers. People who work in the shadows because that's the only place where justice is still possible. Dennison understood what Preston was suggesting. The Underground Railroad, abolitionist networks, activities that were not only illegal but could result in prison time, financial ruin, even violence if discovered. You're talking about breaking the law. I'm talking about following a higher law than the one written in Georgia's legal code. Preston met his eyes steadily. The question is whether you're ready to take that step, because once you start down this path, there's no going back to comfortable ignorance. You'll have made an enemy of Crawford and everyone like him. You'll have risked everything you've built. Are you prepared for that? Dennis thought about those children in the fields, about Thomas who had 12 months left before Crawford sold him away, about the mothers who died because Crawford valued cotton more than human life, about the systematic, calculated cruelty hiding behind a veneer of southern gentility. Yes, he said, I'm prepared. Tell me what I need to do. What Charles Dennison was about to uncover would lead him into the darkest corners of Georgia's plantation system and into an underground network of resistance that risked everything to fight back. If you're as captivated by this true historical mystery as we are, hit that like button now and drop a comment telling us what you think should happen to Horace Crawford. Should he face justice, or does the system protect men like him? Let's find together what Dennis discovered next, because the full extent of Crawford's operation was even more disturbing than anyone imagined. Dr. Preston didn't give Dennis specific names or locations. That would have been too dangerous, too easily traceable if anyone ever questioned Dennis about his activities. Instead, he gave him a series of carefully worded instructions that sounded innocent to anyone who might overhear, but carried specific meaning to those who understood the code. There's a Quaker meeting house about 15 miles outside Savannah. Preston said they gather for worship every Wednesday evening. If you were to attend, you might find people sympathetic to your concerns. Ask to speak with the elder who leads the service. Mention that you're interested in learning about their community's charitable work. Charitable work? That was code for underground railroad activities, for the network that helped enslaved people escape to freedom. Will they trust me? Dennison asked. Not immediately. But if you're patient, if you demonstrate genuine commitment rather than just momentary outrage, they'll eventually bring you into their confidence. These people risk their lives regularly. Mr. Dennison, they're not going to involve someone who might betray them at the first sign of trouble. How long will it take to establish that trust? Weeks, possibly months. This isn't something that can be rushed. Preston paused. In the meantime, you should continue your investigation. Learn everything you can about Crawford's operation. Document it. Build a case. Even if the law won't act now, that evidence might be valuable in the future, and it will help the network understand what they're dealing with. What risks they'd be taking to intervene. Dennis nodded. What specifically should I be looking for? Financial records, if you can access them. How much Crawford paid for the mothers, how much he's received from selling the children. That establishes the profit motive, makes it clear this isn't just abuse, but calculated exploitation. Birth and death records, if they exist. Testimony from people who've witnessed conditions on the plantation, other doctors, merchants who visited, even enslaved people from neighboring properties who might have information, and most importantly, find out where Crawford sells the children when they reach selling age. Who buys them? Where do they go? If we can establish a network of buyers who specifically purchased these light-skinned children, we might be able to apply pressure from multiple directions. It was a daunting list, the kind of investigation that would normally require official authority and legal resources. But Dennis had something else. Motivation, connections in the merchant community, and the ability to travel throughout the region without raising suspicion. One more thing, Preston said as Dennison was preparing to leave. Be very careful. Crawford isn't stupid. If he suspects you're investigating him, if he thinks you pose a threat, he'll act to protect himself. These people have no qualms about violence when their interests are threatened. Document everything, but don't let him know what you're doing. That night, Dennis couldn't sleep. He lay in his bed in his comfortable Savannah townhouse, staring at the ceiling, thinking about those children. What were they doing right now? Sleeping in rough quarters, exhausted from a day of labor under the brutal sun. Did they dream of freedom, or had they never known anything else? Never imagined life beyond the boundaries of Crawford's property. He thought about Thomas, the 13-year-old boy Crawford planned to sell. Did Thomas know yet? Had Crawford told him, or would it be a surprise, men showing up one morning to take him away from everyone he'd ever known? How did you process that? The knowledge that your own father considered you property worth less than the price of a good horse. Around 3 in the morning, Dennis gave up on sleep. He lit a lamp, found paper and ink, and began making notes. Everything he remembered from his visit to the Crawford Plantation. Every detail of his conversation with Crawford, every observation about the children, the property, the conditions. It wasn't much yet, just preliminary notes, but it was a start, the beginning of a record that would grow over the coming weeks and months into something substantial, something damning, something that might, if he was lucky, make a difference. The following Wednesday, Dennis attended the Quaker meeting house outside Savannah. It was a simple building, plain wood construction without the ornamentation that decorated most churches in the region. About 20 people were gathered inside when he arrived, sitting in silence on benches arranged in a square around an empty center space. The silence was unnerving at first. Dennis was used to church services with sermons, hymns, structured liturgy, but the Quakers simply sat waiting for the Spirit to move someone to speak. Minutes passed with nothing but the sound of breathing and the occasional creak of the wooden benches. Then an older man stood. He was tall, thin, with a long beard and clothes that were well made but deliberately simple. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried easily in the silent room. "Friends, I've been thinking about the passage from Isaiah. Learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow. We are called to do more than merely believe in justice. We are called to act." It was a careful statement, one that could be interpreted as general religious encouragement or as something more specific, a reference to their illegal activities helping enslaved people escape. After the meeting ended, Dennis approached the older man who'd spoken. "I'm new to the area," he said, using the script Preston had given him. "I'm interested in learning about your community's charitable work." The man looked at him for a long moment, assessing. "And why is that?" "Because I've recently become aware of suffering that I can no longer ignore, and I've been told your community takes that calling seriously. We do what we can where we can as our conscience demands." The man extended his hand. "I'm Nathan Garrett. Perhaps you'd like to stay for our fellowship meal. We can discuss our various efforts." The fellowship meal was held in a room adjacent to the meeting house. Simple food, bread and soup and vegetables shared communally. About a dozen people stayed, and the conversation ranged across various topics: news from other Quaker communities, concerns about a drought affecting crops, discussions of scripture. But Dennis noticed something. Several times during the meal, Nathan Garrett would make references that seemed innocuous on the surface, but carried deeper meaning to those who knew how to listen. A mention of traveling friends who needed assistance, a comment about goods that needed to be transported north, a question about whether anyone had room to host visitors in the coming weeks. It was all coded, all carefully worded to avoid explicit discussion of illegal activities, but the meaning was clear to anyone paying attention. After the meal, as people were cleaning up, Garrett approached Dennison again. "Walk with me," he said quietly. They stepped outside into the warm Georgia evening. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Garrett led them away from the meeting house toward a small grove of trees where their conversation wouldn't be overheard. "Dr. Preston sent word that you might be coming," Garrett said. "He vouches for you, which counts for something, but trust has to be earned. Why don't you tell me exactly what you're looking for?" Dennis told him about the Crawford Plantation, about the 17 children, about Crawford's systematic breeding program. He described his conversation with Preston, his growing determination to do something about what he'd discovered. Garrett listened without interrupting, his expression troubled but not surprised. "We're aware of the Crawford situation," he finally said. "We've been monitoring it for several years. The problem is access. The plantation is relatively isolated. Crawford keeps tight control over his workforce, and any attempt to help people escape would be extremely dangerous. We've helped a few individuals over the years, people who were being transported or managed to run on their own and found their way to us. But a coordinated effort to remove multiple people from an active plantation, that's much more difficult. But not impossible, just risky. We'd need detailed information about security routines when people are moved off the property. We'd need safe houses established along a route north, reliable conductors willing to take on a dangerous job. And we'd need to be absolutely certain that the people we're helping want to leave, understand the risks, and won't panic halfway through and reveal the network. How can I help establish that?" Garrett studied him carefully. "You're a merchant. You have a legitimate reason to visit plantations to conduct business. You could make regular visits to Crawford's property, observe conditions, learn routines, potentially make contact with the enslaved people there. Not directly. That would be too suspicious. But there are ways to leave messages to establish communication. It's slow, careful work. Nothing dramatic, nothing heroic. Just patient, methodical intelligence gathering. Are you willing to do that? It wasn't what Denison had expected. He'd imagined something more immediate, more active, but he understood the necessity of caution. Moving too fast, being too obvious, would endanger everyone involved. "Yes," he said, "I'm willing. Then we'll teach you how to communicate safely, how to observe without being obvious, how to recognize people in the network, how to move goods, by which I mean human beings, without attracting attention." Garrett paused. "But understand this, Mr. Denison, once you're involved, you're committed. The story of Crawford's plantation is ultimately a story about power, how it is used, how it is abused, and how entire systems can be built to protect cruelty while silencing resistance. It is a story of deep injustice, but also of human choice. A story that unsettles us because it refuses to stay safely in the past. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about complicity, about morality, and about how ordinary people respond when injustice becomes normal. There are no easy answers here, no simple heroes or villains. Yes, Crawford himself stands clearly as a villain, but everyone else exists in a space of moral complexity, making imperfect decisions under impossible circumstances. This was not a legend, not a myth. This was documented history. Real people lived these events. Real people suffered, resisted, escaped, endured, and died. Their lives mattered. Their stories matter still. What makes this story so powerful is that it reminds us history is not abstract. It is not just dates and names written in books. History is made of individual choices, moments of courage or fear, decisions to speak up or to remain silent, actions that either challenge injustice or allow it to continue. The people in this story were not fundamentally different from us. They faced their moral tests just as we face ours. The circumstances change, but the questions remain the same. What do we do when we recognize injustice? At what point does silence become complicity? What are we willing to risk for our principles? And who are we willing to help, even when the cost is high? The Crawford Plantation no longer exists. The land where those 17 children once labored has been divided, rebuilt, repurposed. New crops grow there. Houses now stand where suffering once took place. Everyone involved in this story is gone. Crawford, Dennis, the escapees, and those who were left behind. But the story itself remains. It stands as a testament to what truly happened, a reminder of where we came from, and a challenge to think seriously about the kind of world we are building for our children and grandchildren. These stories matter not because they are comforting, they are not, but because they are true, and truth, however painful, is always worth preserving. This history shows us that the most horrifying chapters of the past are not about monsters or supernatural evil. They are about very real human cruelty, enabled by systems that allowed people to be treated as property. The Crawford Plantation was real. The 17 children were real. The escapes, the brutality, the resistance, and the courage, all of it happened. So now the question turns to us. Do you believe you would have had the courage to help, like Charles Denison and the Underground Railroad Network? Or would you have been among the many who knew what was happening but chose to stay silent? We want to hear your honest thoughts. Share your reflections in the comments below and let us know which country you're watching from by mentioning your country's name. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you reflect on justice, courage, and responsibility, please like the video and share it with someone who values deep historical stories that reveal uncomfortable truths. And if you haven't already, subscribe to our channel, Rite Stories, and turn on notifications so you never miss these important narratives that remind us where we came from and why we must never go back. Thank you for listening to this difficult but necessary story. These histories shape who we are, and remembering them, truly remembering them, without sanitizing or simplifying, is how we honor the people who lived through them and ensure their experiences are not forgotten. We'll see you in the next video, where we uncover another hidden chapter of American history that deserves to be told.